Hello, and welcome to Cutting Through, where we present analysis of foreign policy and domestic politics that cuts through the noise of corporate and ideologically driven media. I'm Mitchell Plitnick, the president of Rethinking Foreign Policy and the author of the Cutting Through newsletter on Substack. You can subscribe to Cutting Through at mitchellplitnick.substack.com, where you can also become a paid subscriber or donate to support this work. And you can share Cutting Through with your friends and contacts there. So, with one day left until election day, um, there's reason, I think, to feel a little bit more optimistic about avoiding Trump 2.0 than there has been in the past. Polls have certainly remained more or less even, and as we know from the past, um, the polls tend to undercount the Trump voters a bit. I believe personally that's a real thing. I think that's because Trump voters tend not to want to talk to pollsters more so than other people, uh, a result of the inevitable paranoia of Trump's whole, if you want to call it, ideological push. So I'm can't say I am optimistic, but I'm more so than I was. I mean, over the weekend, a big poll from a very reliable polling firm in Iowa showed Kamala Harris ahead in that state by 3 points. Now, I don't think Kamala Harris is actually going to win Iowa, but I do think it's going to end up being a lot closer than anyone had thought, considering how well Trump did in Iowa in the last two elections. And I don't think there's much question about what the reason is. The reason, I think, for this kind of swing, for this kind of surprising showing from Kamala Harris, comes down to one issue, and that's abortion. I think women who are centrist, center right, even some who might consider themselves quite conservative, um, when it comes to this issue, I think they change their minds. I think they cross over and say, this push to control women's bodies is just not okay. We can look in a much more deeply red state in Kansas, and we saw what happened when abortion was actually on the ballot. Abortion rights won. So I think we see that this is a big issue, and I think it's certainly one that a lot of people, not just women, feel very strongly about. And I think if Harris does win this election, the reason is going to be abortion rights more than anything else. I think that's what will pull both sort of centrist and right-leaning women over the line to vote for Harris. And I think that issue will also convince a lot of women who might not otherwise vote at all to get out to the polls and actually cast a vote that they wouldn't have. So that would be why she would win. The most, I think there's a number of issues of why she might lose. We can talk about courting the right and the corporatists and the general strategy that she's pursued since, I would say, early August, of tacking to the right and appealing to the more conservative community, which is a strategy. It's one that Hillary Clinton used in 2016, and it's not the one Joe Biden used in 2020 when he reached out to progressives and Bernie Sanders and started making deals with them about what he would do if they voted for him, and actually did live up to some of those deals. Most of the positive things that we saw Biden do on a national scale, like his appointments to the National Labor Relations Board and some of giving Bernie a much stronger voice in the Senate. Those things happened because progressives were who Biden recognized he needed to appeal to, and Kamala seems to have forgotten that. But if we're going to point to one issue, the one that's been most prominent and the most in the news, obviously, I think it's Palestine and it's Gaza. And it's the genocide there. And it's how many people cannot bring themselves to vote for a woman who is literally engineering a genocide. And we can talk about, oh, she's the moderating voice in the White House, and she's the one trying to convince Biden to. Fact of the matter is, she's the vice president, and this is her administration's policy. And she has not broken with the president. We have seen vice presidential candidates break with their presidents before. We saw that in 1968. it was too little too late at that time, but it clearly made a big difference on election day and got a lot of votes for Hubert Humphrey in 68 that he would not have otherwise gotten. Unfortunately, Biden and Harris have not chosen to do something similar. Yeah, Humphrey kind of did that with LBJ's blessing, and um, Biden has not taken that road, and Kamala has not pressed for him to do so. Apparently, and in any case, it hasn't happened. And I think this is a huge mistake. As I noted in an article or in a piece I put out here a few weeks ago, there is a very simple path that Kamala Harris can pursue to take on this issue of Gaza and the Middle East in general, and get at a good chunk of the voters who will not right now vote for her to tick her box in their ballot booth tomorrow, and that's simply by supporting the letter from Antony Blinken and Lloyd Austin 3 weeks ago that demanded that Israel live up to its responsibilities under U.S. law for receiving its military aid. Now, it was an empty threat. We know it was just political showmanship. They went out of their way to make sure that there were no specific consequences even implied in the letter. But it would have meant something. She could have used that to say, look, Israel has to live up to this. Israel has to do this. And as president, I'm going to make sure that Israel does live up to this if they want to continue getting the arms. Now, that would not have been nearly enough. It would not be enough for Israel to stop what it's doing in Gaza, but it would have been enough for Harris to show that she just cared a little bit. She seems, frankly, to have gone out of her way to not only double down on the policies of the Biden administration, but to literally spit in the face of everyone who cares about Palestine. She seems to have done this at almost every opportunity. We see her campaigning in Michigan with Richie Torres, of all people. I mean, one of the most notorious anti-Palestinian bigots in all of Congress, and that includes Republicans. And she's bringing him to Michigan, which is literally the focal point of the support of Palestine that she is losing. It's a state where Arab Americans, excuse me, are actually polling almost even between her and Trump. Many will certainly vote third party. I think there's no question about that. And she's bringing Richie Torres in there, and then she brings in Bill Clinton to go on a horrific and disgusting racist diatribe, blaming Palestinians for their own victimhood, completely absolving Israel of any wrongdoing in this genocide. It was obscene. It was literally obscene. And to do it, and he did it in such a condescending and smarmy manner, which is, I understand Bill Clinton. But to put that out there again in Michigan, you just have to ask, what is she thinking when she constantly responds to protesters by saying, I'm speaking now? I understand it gets her a lot of whoop whoops from her passionate supporters, but it does nothing to appeal to people who care about Palestine, who feel they're not being heard. It only reinforces that she's not listening. Yeah, she's speaking. She's not listening. I mean, I think we can look, if we want to sort of sum up Kamala Harris's approach on this issue, what she said yesterday, talking about Gaza. She said, and I'm quoting here, that she would, quote, do everything in my power to end the war in Gaza, to bring home the hostages, end the suffering in Gaza, ensure Israel is secure, and ensure the Palestinian people can realize their right to dignity, freedom, security, and self-determination. Now, that last clause about all these wonderful things that the Palestinian people can realize, that is just lifted directly from every single speech, every single time he was asked about this from Joe Biden. This is his talking point, and it has been from day one. And if you think Palestinian Americans aren't paying attention to that, you're wrong. They hear it. They hear the exact same words that Biden used. Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, has used it over and over and over again. I mean, he just never fails whenever this comes up. I think it's also important to recognize that she talks about the war in Gaza. I mean, we all know that's problematic language. It's not a war in Gaza, it's a war on Gaza. Um, there is no war in Gaza. Israel is simply destroying the Gaza Strip. Um, but that is already. I mean, I think to even think about that, to even consider, to even imagine that she would use different language, and that is just it's beyond imagination. So, okay, if we move past that, but the first thing she says about why to end the war is to bring home the hostages. To bring home the hostages. That's the first thing. Now, those hostages should be home. Those hostages should never have been taken. Okay, the taking of hostages is a war crime, and it's a severe one. And considering what Israel's doing to Gaza, those hostages have been subjected to over a year of just horrible conditions, like everyone else in Gaza. Um, so, except they also have to stay completely hidden. So I imagine that just reinforces how bad the conditions are. Although from all reports, um, there have been some cases of abuse, but on the whole, it does seem like Israeli hostages have been living in the same conditions as their captors. So for whatever that's worth, and that's pretty horrific right now. It's horrible. The hostages should be home. There's no question. But is the fate of those 100 people really the first concern? Is that really what has to be the first concern? It's not the 16,000 dead Palestinian children. That's not. It's not Israel bombing polio vaccination sites. Not to mention the devastation of what it's doing right now in northern Gaza, literally leveling every town and village there, with no regard for the civilians. The people who could get out just we have the videos. We've all seen them of them marching, literally a death march out of northern Gaza. Um, in the most horrible visions one might have of the historical Trail of Tears, this is a lot of what it looks like. Not to mention that when Palestinians see this, I have no doubt that it is extremely reminiscent of the Nakba of 1948. So even more traumatizing. But that's the people who can get out. There are still hundreds of thousands still there who can't get out for whatever reason, because they're afraid to leave their homes because they don't think they'll ever be able to come back to them, and they're right. That may be one reason. Could be that they think that they will not survive the journey. Many of them can't make the journeys. Many are sick or injured, and others have to care for those people. Many reasons why people would stay there. But Israel has already made it clear that anyone who does stay is considered a legitimate target by them. So they're not even kidding around anymore. We're just going to kill everybody, is what they said. We can talk about the starvation that 2 million people are facing right now in Gaza. We can talk about the fact that despite this letter that I mentioned earlier from the Secretaries of State and Defense, October was the month that saw the least aid get into Gaza, and it broke the record of September. So all this talk about how we're facilitating humanitarian aid, we're making sure Israel's going to do this. This is just nonsense. It's just not true. The opposite is the case. When the U.S. makes these public demands, Israel actually cuts down the amount of aid that they allow through. And that's the amount of aid that actually just gets into Gaza. We're not even talking about getting it to the people and how difficult that is. Israel just broke off all of its relationships with UNRWA, which means that UNRWA is effectively paralyzed, which means that even aid that does get into Gaza cannot be distributed. But the first thing Harris is worried about is the 100 Israeli hostages, who I will stress again should never have been kidnapped. It is a crime that they were, and they should be home right now. Those who have died, their bodies should be returned. This was a crime. This was absolutely a crime, and it should be treated as such. But it's not the only crime, and for that to top the list, when we're talking about an official count of 42,000 dead in Gaza, of over 100,000 injured, and these are just the direct reports that the medical network in Gaza can document. I mean, we see where her priorities are. She's not making any secret of it, and it's horrible. It really is. It is ignoring a genocide of the worst kind. This is akin to denial of any genocide, whether it's the Holocaust, whether it's the Armenian genocide. We've seen these arguments, and we look at them and we say, how can you deny these genocides? It's barbaric. This one is actually happening and it's being denied. And that's worse than to talk about what did happen. To talk about the past and to deny the to deny the genocides of the past is horrific and it's barbaric and it's racist and it's all of those terrible things. But to deny one that's actually happening is worse because that means you're refusing to stop it. And of course, she is. Um, and it's worth also noting that when Harris talks about ending the suffering in Gaza, as if it was a natural disaster, as if there was no agency, as if Israel wasn't doing it and wasn't doing it with U.S. weapons, U.S. money, and U.S. political backing. Okay, to deny all of that responsibility, this is why people don't want to vote for Kamala Harris. And this was her trying to reach out. This is her version of trying to reach out. It's bizarre. It really is. And I do think in the end, certainly if she loses Michigan, this will be why. And that's not the only state. There are Arab communities in other key swing states, including Pennsylvania, including Georgia. These are key communities in states that have razor thin margins between her and Trump. It's heartbreaking and it's difficult. And I take this view not because in any way I think Kamala Harris is a solution to any problems, not just the Middle East. I mean, I think it's very clear from her campaign. She has tried to the extent that she's tried to distinguish herself from Joe Biden, it's been by tacking even more to the right than him, and he's one of the most conservative Democrats. During his time in the Senate, he was one of the most conservative Democrats in there all along. Her disdain for the progressive wing of the party is very clear, whereas Biden, who also had great disdain for the progressive wing of the party, dropped that disdain when he wanted to get elected. Harris is not doing that. So believe me, I don't think Harris is a solution, but you can see if you go to MiddleEastEye.net, my latest piece on what a Trump presidency would look like just for the Middle East. It's not even talking about every place else. I mean, and this is in the Middle East where, the difference between, I do agree that the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans on Middle East policy is much, much, much smaller than it is certainly in domestic policy. But even there, Trump would be a nightmare. And again, MiddleEastEye.net. On Friday, I published a piece about what a second Trump term would look like, and you can see it there. So I'm under no illusions about Harris, but Trump, is a threat on many levels. Personally, I live in Maryland. It's a blue state. Harris is going to win here. I don't feel like I have to vote for her, and I'm not going to. But if I drove north for an hour, I would be in Pennsylvania. And if that's where I lived, I'd be in a swing state. And I have to be honest, I would vote for her. It would be the hardest thing politically I think I've ever done, because I think she's horrific. But the threat of Trump is worse. I can get into all the political reasons, and there's so many of them. And we can talk about the fascism. We can talk about the intention to dismantle virtually all of our social services. We can talk about the quote unquote threat to democracy, which we have to have a democracy first, but what few institutions we have, Trump would certainly threaten. We can talk about all of that. In the end, what it comes down to for me is what it comes down to for a lot of people who can't bring themselves to vote for Harris under any circumstances, and it's personal. I do have friends in Gaza, in the West Bank. Um, I have friends here who have family and close friends in those places as well as in Lebanon. People who are really under threat from both sides. But I also have people who are very near and dear to me who are trans, genderqueer, non-binary. Those people literally face a threat to their lives with Donald Trump. Um, the hateful rhetoric that has been on display in this campaign, for any of you who've seen the TV ads and other places, it's horrifying. I have friends who are immigrants who are not citizens, some of whom are undocumented. Those people are under physical threat. These are people whose lives are on the line. And yes, people in Gaza, their lives are on the line. People in Lebanon, their lives are on the line, but their lives will be on the line with either one of these candidates. So for me, I would find a way if I had to vote for Harris. Fortunately, I don't have to make that choice, and I will not vote for Harris. I will not give her my support. And in the coming weeks, I hope to bring to you some more ideas about what we can do to make sure we don't have to make this kind of choice again. But for now, I just want to remind everyone, whether you're voting for Harris or not, if you have any influence within the Democratic Party, and that means if you're a Democrat, if you're a registered Democrat, or you're someone whose vote the Democrats want, make your voice heard. Tell the Democrats that the way they're treating supporters of Palestine among their own constituents is just not okay. That message has got to get through. It's got to get through today. It's got to get through tomorrow. And it's got to get through not just 4 years from now when another presidential election rolls around. It's got to get through every single day between now and then. And I'm going to be talking more about that in the coming weeks, whoever wins this election. Um, but, uh, again, just, wrapping that up, I think we are seeing right now a very clear message being sent from the Harris campaign to supporters of Palestine. And it is, I expect you to vote for me no matter how horrifically I treat you. And one way or another, I'm not, at all suggesting that, I mean, they have, strategically speaking, a point, in the sense of how many of us just don't, really just can't sanction the idea of a Trump 2.0. But for that to be used in this way is itself really disgusting. For that to be used to basically force people to vote is horrible. That's not democracy, and we need to change it. So uh, that's my last word before election day tomorrow. And I hope everyone goes out and vote your conscience, vote what you think is best, vote what you think is right, because the fact that we don't do that is where the problems come in. If you vote what you think is right, if we were all doing that in every primary and in every election, we wouldn't have to worry or think about what's a strategic vote, because the strategic vote concept is itself kind of a trap. Again, something I'll be talking about in the next few weeks. Thanks again for listening. One more time, you can support this work at mitchellplitnick.substack.com. You can donate through Cash App. There's a button there for that. You can become a paid subscriber. I would really, really appreciate that. Your support is how I can keep doing this work. Thanks very much, and go vote.